Good. We were good.
Hello, this is Stanton Peele, and I'm here with Zach Rhodes. He's in Burlington, Vermont, and I'm in Dipness Park, Brooklyn. And we're going to return to a topic that we've dealt with before. It's a topic that never goes away. And we've got, maybe some excited add-on elements. So let's begin. You sent me an email about a study. Do you want to mention anything about the study that you passed along to me, Zach?
Sure. Let me pull it up real quick. But I sent it to you in jest, really, because it's sort of like you said one time, which I'll always remember and I repeat. It's like a mantra that you really can't go wrong repeating a disease theory of addiction, no matter who you are, what line of work you're in. And it's become that you can't really go wrong regurgitating the idea of trauma and addiction and the link between them. And it's an especially insidious myth because there are so many truths baked into it. Like, people do encounter trauma, and a lot of people who are addicted or have been addicted in the past have sort of by definition gone through traumatic events, and many of them in childhood. We'll parse that apart. The recent one I sent is...
Well, I can summarize it, I think. Looking at people with opioid substance use disorders, and I found that quite a large minority, well into the 40s of women who had SUDs, opioid related, had been sexually abused as children. The percentage of men, perhaps it's logical to people, is quite a bit smaller. It's about 15%. And so, they draw logical conclusions. Well, being sexually abused causes you to subsequently, years, decades, sometimes later, become an opioid addict. So let me deconstruct that data a little bit. This is a little technical, but when I first wrote a piece that got everybody's attention, including Gabor's, it was called The Seductive but Dangerous Allure of Gabor Mate. I wrote it with a man named Alan Cudmore. And one of the things we reviewed was people with extreme adverse childhood events were more likely to become alcohol or narcotic use disorder sufferers. However, the data were somewhat mixed. 18% of people with 3 or more AHCEs developed an alcohol use disorder, and the standard range for people that age was 6%. So it's elevated. It's elevated in a very noticeable way. On the other hand, you sort of think, 82% of people who had pretty severe childhood traumas, and HCEs involve things like your parents were in jail, some mild things like your parents were divorced, you came from a drug abusing household, you came from a economically disintegrated or impoverished neighborhood or family, you came from a bad background, and yet only 18% developed an alcohol use disorder. The number of heroin use disorders was almost microscopic. A couple of percentage points. Of course, it's still several times as high as the general population. But one thing that you and I have gone over that we can never go over enough is considering that 100 million Americans, roughly speaking, have used an opioid painkiller, the percentage of people that develop an opioid use disorder is minuscule. It's about 1 or 1.5% of that population. That's a fact that we can never drum into people's heads enough. And especially if you attach the word heroin to opioid, then people just freak out. So when you see population, in this population, they identify as people who suffered, who have an opioid use disorder. The question you want to ask yourself is, golly, who develops an opioid use disorder? What person develops? And it's relevant because many of those people are the people that Gabor Mate originally researched in Vancouver under the Portland Hotel Services. what human beings develop an opioid use disorder? And people who are in negative and isolated and deprived and marginalized positions in society. Because it's virtually everybody, if I go into an audience, I say, well, how many people have had an opioid, narcotic, and a painkiller? And everybody raised their hand. And I say, well, how many of you became addicted? And nobody raised their hand. And I said, well, how many of you felt some allure from it? And then some, percentage of people, 5% raised their hands. I say, well, how come you didn't become addicted? And they say, well, I'm not going to do that. I've got children, I've got a job. It's a segment of society. Now, if you backtrack from that segment of society has often suffered quite a lot of trauma. I visited at the invitation of Liz Evans, the head of the Portland Hotel Services.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a population with a lot of traumas. They're not people that you run into every day, at the University of Vermont or Penn or even in harm reduction societies. They're people who are very marginalized, often with tenuous mental health. It's a difficult population that she worked with. She's not there anymore. And that Gabor worked with. And, obviously they were thrust into that position by their life experience. And ironically, there's something Gabor and I agree on. He's big on epigenetics, which means, well, they weren't born that way. They were traumatized in a way that led them that way. But what is the solution when you face people like that? What are the ways that we prevent and help those human beings? Here, you jump in, Zach. What kind of quick answers occur to you, and do we work on?
The most practical ways, the ways that you say to anybody to help, the ways that you would help anybody move forward and look ahead and be optimistic and regain some strategies for making life manageable and feeling well. And for the most part, people know what those are. And they have nothing to do with, sure, people who are addicted and in throes of terrible circumstances in life need them. So do everybody. The same principles that you'd say, well, I have a loved one who's going through a rough time. The same principles that you might use to help propel them forward, the same principles you'd use to help the most, disparaged populations that you might want to face, trauma or no trauma.
In the Life Process program, we don't go, oh my God, what a horrible traumatized life you've had. We recognize people have had traumas. We appreciate that. We accept and understand that. But that's not our focus, because that does no good. And just to take one step backward or forward, how do you prevent the people who end up in the Portland Hotel Services from being there? Well, somehow you have to create a society where there are fewer people who are marginalized and marginalized families. We're not good at that.
Yeah, let me pause. So you might say somebody who wants to focus on trauma would have an argument, well, we have to stop the trauma. But the thing is that something new? Is that people before the trauma theorists, did people want bad homes for children or difficult circumstances? So that's the thing. Even when I hadn't thought much about addiction or anything, I went to see Gabor speak, which we'll get to, and I know, but I remember him talking about that, and that was the thought that entered my mind. It just doesn't seem like any of this is new. Why, to the extent that it's sensible, it's not new.
And calling it trauma, and now they have a second generational, transgenerational trauma, which is a way of saying, well, people have been brought up in really crappy circumstances, and they reinvent those circumstances. And so you're still back to, well, how do you prevent those circumstances from happening in the first place? And it's a simple question. And not only are there not simple answers, but you can argue that we're going backwards in terms of approaching them. And the United States as a country has always been poorly prepared for dealing with societal inequality, and we've gotten worse at it. Inner city Baltimore and East St. Louis and the Appalachian and West Virginia haven't improved their social and rural New England haven't improved their social conditions in the last 10 or 20 years. They've gotten worse. And calling things trauma and isolating them as individual motifs, if anything, makes it harder for us to do that. But getting back to individual therapy, so we're saying you can, if you want, find trauma in people who have addictive problems. That's something, you know, what's that enterprise about though? When you go to the Portland Hotel Services and you talk to those people, it's not a mysterious discovery that they have had traumatized backgrounds. But they tend not to be such good therapy clients. I mean, they don't have money. They don't have insurance. And so that market is expanded to include the broad middle class of therapy seeking clients. You shaking your head, yes. Does that ring a bell for you? Or do you see that in your own practice and life?
Yeah. It's a theory that's touted by that population now. So everyone's looking for it within that population. And I notice it all the time. I notice it where people will substitute it's trauma, let's focus on the trauma, instead of practical solutions that could be generated. We'll get to all of that. That's why I'm shaking my head.
Well, we are. But I mean, it's relevant to talk about. The Life Process program, we've said this before, is about accepting and seeing what people's backgrounds are, not overreacting to them, which we would interpret as being, oh my God, I'm ruined. Mm-hmm. I mean, if somebody comes to you and they explain to you why their life is decimated, a good counselor and the Life Process program doesn't go, oh my God, you're right. You're doomed. I mean, that's so ridiculous to even imagine that, you know, people might say, well, you're just talking common sense. You've got to start the base you're at and build from there. And that's what we do in Life Process program. And that's what the best therapy, no matter what level of trauma people have. And that's what Portland Hotel, what I loved about Liz Evans was she got people a place to live. She actually owned bakeries. She got businesses. Why did she have businesses? Because people had to work. And so she put them to work in businesses. She created, that Liz Evans, man, she was a whirling dervish. She started a bank because a lot of these people are like in financial, some kind of hole. They needed, first of all, to have some place to put their money, and then they needed to learn, you know, how productive people kind of make money and save it. They're kind of basic, but she was dealing with a lot of people who hadn't developed fundamental skills. Even when I spoke at the Portland Hotel Services, however, everybody, here's where I've been unprepared for reality. Everybody in the group starts going, well, when I talk about addiction, they all start mouthing off brain chemistry bullshit. And I said, well, you work for Portland Hotel Services. You take people where they're at, you give them a place to live, you give them a social group and respect, you help them find work, you help them to master basic skills. And you're going to tell me when we talk about addiction, about brain trauma, that's what that has nothing to do with what you know and what you actually do.
Do you know the reporter, have you heard of Travis Lupick? He wrote a book called Fighting for Space, which is about Liz Evans and that journey. And when I talked to him, yeah, we wrote a whole book about it. And that I asked him, you know, did she have some sort of grand plan? Was her idea, you know, people with addictions aren't getting the right, you know, tools that they need. We need to, you know, back up and do kind of grassroots effort. I said, not really. She just was kind of like trying to be nice. And she thought maybe these people need a place to live. And then every time she's noticed, okay, well, they have a place to live, but I guess that's not really enough because they still seem to be suffering. So she just built from there, and she saw the next logical step all the way through. And he was saying that I don't want to put words, I don't want to bastardize his whole theory, but I think what I took away from it was that the people who might be spouting off the neuroscience kind of thing were the people who are trying to act as consults for someone like Liz Evans, saying, all right, you've got the practical stuff, we'll take care of the disease theory stuff, and we can really make a thing out of this. So, you know, she felt like
I don't even know if you know, I have a bit of a relationship with Liz, which I have with sort of everybody in the addiction field, and it's sort of a strange one. Liz saw me speak at Liverpool at an International Harm Reduction Conference, and she came over to my hotel because she specifically wanted to speak to me. And it ended up with me coming to visit Portland Hotel Services. But if I were to summarize for you what it was she wanted to speak to me about, I couldn't. Because Liz Evans isn't, her father was quite a distinguished doctor, I think, in Toronto. But Liz didn't go that route. You know, she didn't follow the intellectual route. She followed the gut instinct route. And so why she was talking to me was she rejected the disease theory. She had 12-step proponents in her population of helpers, and it just rubbed her the wrong way. And she wanted me to come and talk to them. But she couldn't express that. But why would Liz Evans come all the way to see me while I was in Liverpool and then invite me from where I was living at the time in New Jersey all the way the hell out to Vancouver? What was she trying to accomplish? And she was using me as a kind of a front man, as kind of an intellectual version of her gut instincts in this area. So that wasn't, you know, 100% successful interaction, but, you know, why change my course of living right now? Because I had to tell people, what the fuck are you talking about? And you're focusing on what you don't know. You're focusing on things that you've heard somewhere, which don't happen to be true, instead of building from what you know to work and what the whole raison d'etre is about your place. And so the memory, Gabor wasn't any longer working there, but his influence pervaded the place. Everybody there knew him. So let's switch. Talk about the time you met Gabor Mate, how you came into contact with Gabor Mate.
Oh, well, I had just read I was getting interested in the addiction field. It was right around the time, it was just before I spoke to you, I guess, for the first time. I was getting interested in addiction because I had just started this little podcast that I do, and it was basically your addiction theory for developmentalists, specialists, or teachers, saying, you know, you got to ditch all of the super nuanced hyper focus on, you know, new trends and things like that, and just let's get back to common sense. And once we do that, maybe we can get fancy. So I thought that addiction was pretty interesting because I started seeing some similarities. I read his book. Help me out. I forget what it's called.
Hungry Ghosts.
Yeah, in the realm of Hungry Ghosts. Yeah, in the realm of Hungry Ghosts. And I did read it cover to cover. And, you know, I found him to be, well, an excellent writer, almost poetic the way he writes, and seemingly very compassionate. And he did sort of bypass a lot of nonsense, but I noticed he was stuck on this, you know, trauma uber alles kind of mentality. And I was weirded out by it, and it didn't rub me the right way. And
one other thing I want to throw in here, when I talk about trauma theory is a disease theory. Because really is, yeah. One way you can look at people and say, holy mackerel, they've had a lot of trauma. That's not good for them. And they're still living in a traumatic background. They don't know how to escape it. That's one way of thinking about it. That's not Gabor's way of thinking about it. Yeah. Gabor devotes chapters to saying trauma ruins your brain permanently.
Yes.
Gabor Mate is a disease theorist, and he likes powerlessness and AA because it's consistent with this point of view. So I meet people who are not diseased people, like Liz Evans, and they read his book, and I say, well, he's a disease theorist. They say, well, what are you talking about? He's about trauma. And then I sort of figure, well, I guess they skipped those sections, you know?
Yeah. It's almost like Well, that's the kind of thing. You have a guru kind of person who hits all the right notes in some areas. It's almost like people who don't mind practicing mindfulness with people who will, also have disturbing beliefs at the same time. Yeah, he wrote different chapters devoted to endogenous opioid systems in your brain, and if you're traumatized enough, then that's affected, and that's why you want more opioids. And anyway, so that was one of the things that caught me off guard too. So I went to see him, and he talked about his theory, and then he asked people in the room, if you're, look, I know some people might be suspicious about this, but let's just say if you have an addiction or some mental illness or something like that, and you think that you didn't have trauma in your life, then raise your hand. And my hand shot up. I really wanted to do this with him. He didn't pick me, but he did pick a guy who, he said, I don't think I had really trauma. So we asked him questions about his life. And so what do you think you were, were your parents, I got bullied in school. Oh, you got bullied. Okay. So when did you tell your parents? Well, sometimes, but so I would kind of try to keep it from them, and went down this road. So the minutia of him being bullied in school and then not telling his parents sometimes is what Gabor turned into this, illuminating this incident as, see, you had these feelings of shame and guilt, and your parents weren't able to talk to you, and you weren't able to talk to your parents, and then that blossomed, or whatever you call it, that grew in you throughout your life. And so you see, trauma. Everyone, oh yeah, oh, woo! And I just remember thinking,
how did you react to the audience's reaction?
I was horrible. I looked around, I'm just out amazed. It must be how you feel your whole career, looking around at people trying to come up with addiction theories.
I mean, what would I say? What would I say to people like that? I say, do you feel that exercise that Gabor performed, which is traumatic in itself, do you feel that's therapeutic? I mean, do you feel that's how people are helped forward, by being revealed that they underestimate the amount of trauma they had in their life, and that you reiterate and identify and emphasize that? Is that your idea of therapy? And there's no therapeutic basis for doing that. But more than that, when I see people act like that, I feel, am I in the Roman Colosseum? Yeah, they've just seen this guy humiliated based on some stupid parlor game trick, and they love it. He
saved him. They thought Gabor saved this guy. It was one of those, like, you'll thank me later. I even remember the last words were, and so don't you feel like that's trauma, or something like that? And he said, maybe. And Gabor said, maybe? How about yes? I said, okay, yes. And that's when everyone cheered. And I just looked around thinking, everyone, you forgot why you're here. You thought that was so interesting.
What therapy is.
Yeah. There was a room full, hundreds of therapists in the room. And that's what the people that were clapping. So that's the horrible part.
So let me go to current events.
Okay.
I have, one of the ways you knew about me is you looked me up, and I wrote, the alluring but dangerous appeal of Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
To this day, I get hundreds of emails based on that piece. And they're not usually positive. In my life, I've gotten thousands, tens of thousands of attacks for not being, for being anti-AA. But really, in recent decades or years, those have been far exceeded by Gabor Mate fans. And I sort of it took me aback. I didn't realize that Gabor Mate was a mass movement. He's the most important and influential therapist. I didn't realize I was taking on AA and Gabor Mate is a great AA backer. And so I didn't realize, I didn't realize what I was taking on. I was on a list where I talked about Gabor Mate, and a woman that you and I interviewed, who I consider one of the bravest people in the field, wrote me privately, oh, I agree with you 100%. And I said, well, why don't you speak out on the list? And she said, are you crazy? And get attacked, around the clock. And I thought, oh my God, I view this woman as fearless. And she runs scared from dealing with what I'm somehow have gotten myself into. So here is the last email I got based on that article I wrote in 2013 now, you know, almost 10 years ago. It's titled POS. Do you know what POS means?
Yeah, why don't you read? People will figure it out.
And this is, there's 3 sentences in the email. And I think I can say I've gotten hundreds like this. Hey, Stanton, you're a piece of shit. So the first thing all of these emails do is they insult me. They say I'm crap, I'm worthless.
So starting the argument off on a good foot.
Then they say, not only for disrespecting the brilliant Gabor Mate, but for introducing doubt into one of the strongest philosophies of healing. So the second thing is how Gabor is God. They're all 3 sentences long. You have hurt countless people. Unpublish this article, you fucking asshole.
I just want to say I'm sorry that I sent that email.
Oh, I mean, ironically, this email, well, we'll talk about who sent this email. How do you react to a human being who expresses themselves that way personally?
I don't really. I don't. I mean, with a feeling of empathy a little bit, because I feel like they're so far gone, at least in that argument.
We have a program called the Life Process Program, and we're strong in our opinions. What if one of your clients said, oh, you're so right, this is a letter I wrote to, you know, my local AA guy or to Nora Volko, and they wrote that letter to them? How would you react? How would you feel, and how would you speak with them?
Yeah, I might ask them questions about why they felt that was healing or beneficial or helped them in any way or made them a better part of, pro-social kind of a, if that was a pro-social move or made them a better man of society or something like that. Yeah,
I'll riff on how you react. I think you would react with a little bit of horror. You would think, you know, I'm not in this business to have people have reactions like that. That's not why.
Right. It wouldn't be if somebody sent that thinking, check it out, I did what you told me and I sent this letter. I'd be horrified that someone would think that I would back that up. Yeah.
And if you were having an earnest conversation with them, you react therapeutically. You say, well, what do you think you were doing? If you were like just leveling, you might say, you know, I don't really feel it's helpful for a human being to express themselves that way. Right. I mean, we're not that concerned about Nora Volko or your local AA person.
Or Gabor. If someone wrote that letter to Gabor Mate, that'd feel the same way.
You know, we're here to help you, and you know, let's just keep it between you and me and your family. You know what I mean? Now, I actually had a period of my life, and I've had an unusual life. Sometimes I wonder. I talk about the time Gabor wanted to meet with me, and we had breakfast in Vancouver when I was giving a lecture there. And he pulled that routine with me. He did that trick with me. He says, I can see that you have a deep underlying pain. And I said, you do this all the time, you do that even in your personal interactions? But I recognize this is we sort of had almost a personal relationship, and I would send him these emails, and I get plenty of them. And what was I naively imagining? I was naively imagining that he would be shocked and horrified that people were writing emails like this on his behalf.
Yeah.
I would be. I would think, you know, I'm not doing the right thing. This is not what I'm in the business for. I want people to reject Gabor's logic. I don't want him to be the dominant force in North America, but he's still going to be 10 million times more powerful than me. And people will believe in him, you know, just like people believe in AA. God bless them. I would never, ever, not only encourage anybody to do this, but I would feel horrified that they had done it. And Gabor never once responded to them. And so here's, the thoughts I express now don't represent LPP. They don't reflect on stories on Sundays or you or anything. In my thinking, I view Gabor Mate like I view Donald Trump. you know, when Donald Trump says something like, whatever the hell those guys, those white supremacists are called, I don't know what the poor boys are or the white boys are. I do know that they support me, though. And that's how Gabor looks. That's how Donald Trump and Gabor look at life. You know, they don't evaluate what those people are like or how healthy their responses are. Of course, Donald Trump is whatever Donald Trump is. Gabor Mate is a people helper, supposedly. I feel he welcomes those emails. He certainly I've never seen him say anything negative about them. He never reflected back to me. I've never seen him say something like, you know, I wish you wouldn't do this sort of thing. And I think Gabor Mate, like Donald Trump, is intolerant of any kind of disagreement, you know, like those exercises he goes through, proving that anybody who thinks that their addiction or other problem isn't due to trauma, proving they're wrong and publicly belittling them, that's a part of a profile. So, you know, you're aware of what Gabor confesses is his own addiction, are you?
Yeah, it was either records or CDs, just buying classical music albums.
So, okay, you know, whatever. And, you know, he's going and he takes ayahuasca, which is a psychedelic, in order to come to grips with his past. As I understand it, Gabor Mate's mother was pregnant in Austria when the Nazis came. I don't know that he personally was in Austria when the Nazis arrived, but his version of his trauma was prenatal. His mother was so anxious. And that translated into his major problem. When he confesses that addiction, you know, I don't belittle it, but it's sort of like when somebody does an interview and you say to them, what's your biggest problem? And they say, oh, I work too hard. You know what I mean? And that's supposed to be your confession about your major problem. It's like Gabor Mate, I'm traumatized. I had an addiction. I loved classical music CDs too much. And sometimes I would really go overboard buying them and listening to them. And so I feel that his ayahuasca coach isn't earning his keep. If I were, you know, coaching his coach, I would say, why don't you explore with Gabor his total intolerance of any kind of disagreement, his need to coerce people publicly and to exert control over them, and his intolerance for the slightest bit of criticism. I'll just refer to one other it's another person you and I both know. I don't know that you know this story. He interviewed Gabor, and among other things he told me was when he wrote Gabor what he wrote about him, which was overwhelmingly positive, Gabor made no acknowledgement of anything positive this writer said, and picked out the one or two slightly less than perfectionist things the guy said about him. And so I would coach Gabor's ayahuasca coach, you know, you might try and get Gabor to understand why he has this need to feel that he can't be criticized in any way, shape, or form, why he needs to feel in control, complete, total, and dominant control of every situation, and why he organizes his interactions with people that way, and how that translates into his therapy. Maybe he could take a period off of 6 months to a year and reflect on this, and perhaps it would improve his own dealings with people, and perhaps it would minimize this army of people who go around. You know, I could only imagine, you know, we're all aware of the January 6th assault on the Capitol building in Washington. So in my life, I've felt as though I were like manning a Capitol building where I'm being assaulted by people who have convinced themselves that they're doing God's work and that they're doing by bringing me down, by attacking me. I've never been physically attacked. My former wife, that used to be a big fear she had. She thought somebody was going to assassinate me one time. And I'd say, well, they'd have to find their way all the way to hell out to Morristown. You know, it's kind of impossible to get to our house. You know what I mean? We live at the end of a long driveway. So I you know, maybe I should have been more worried, but I've never been physically attacked. I've been publicly attacked by all sorts of people. So, you know, I want to get down to the whole superstructure of the traumatization of American and North American therapy, how counterproductive it is, why people endorse and embrace it so much.
That's good, because I wanted to ask you. That's what I wanted to ask.
What it does for them, how it in itself, it's like a movement. And for God forgive me, it reminds me of the kind of movement that people like Gabor, bless him, and I'm Jewish and Gabor's Jewish, struggle to escape. People, mass movements that ostracize and attack symbolic others, which is what the Trump movement's doing now. Oh, these people are responsible for our being downtrodden, for our, being economically marginalized. And it's more of an expression of a mass movement than it is of a mass psychotherapeutic approach with productive results. It's possible that one or two people that see this will be offended.
Yeah.
Obviously, Gabor Mate is unassailable. He's atop the pyramid of North American therapists. I was originally shocked when the Canadian Harm Reduction Association regularly featured workshops by him. I was baffled. I say, this isn't, of course he worked with people who had drug problems. He didn't think they should go to prison. God bless him. But this is not harm reduction therapy. And what we practice in the Life Process program is harm reduction therapy. We take people as they are, we accept and we sympathize with what they've been through. We don't dramatize it. We certainly don't seek it out. We are empathic with it, and we say we understand and we feel for you. And then as rapidly as possible, we turn their eyesight towards productive goals, things they can achieve, ways that we can help them. Because the only answer in life, they don't give you credit for being able to cite your trauma resume. And we do resume exercises. We say, well, write a resume where all the bad things that have happened to you happened. And then we say, well, write a resume where you transform those things into positives. Either you say, well, even those bad things had certain benefits to them. And, how they led me in a direction that I was able to convert in a positive direction, because that's the only way forward in life. Any final thoughts on all of this, Zach? I know it's a realm you've been involved in your own life and work with others, with children. Obviously run into children. You only run into children who have problems that, people don't contact you to, talk about their kids who are, Eagle Scouts and on the Dean's list. Mm. And so you're often in situations that are less than ideal. Everybody knows they're less than ideal. Everybody involved in this situation. How would you say you approach those negative, sometimes bailiwicks of negativity?
First of all, when people talk about their traumas of their kids or their students, usually they're relieved if I say, yeah, I'll just treat them normally. So that alone sort of backfires on the entire trauma enterprise, at least for kids, because there's such effort that people go through to try to explain away different problems that they might have via, reverse engineering some trauma story, which in a lot of cases it's true. Like, you would never argue that some of these people with their upbringings weren't traumatic. But then once that narrative is perpetuated, people will talk about these kids and, well, they have so much trauma, and I can say, don't worry, relax. We'll just move along like normal. And people love that, because then you stop pathologizing things and you start treating people like human beings again. So my question for you, well, it's not a question, but we could throw it around a little bit. What are people getting from the trauma story? A lot of people, what are people getting from the trauma story? And specifically the people who completely disagree with the disease theory and don't realize that this is a disease theory in drag. What are they getting from trauma theory? Why do they love it so much? Why does it feel like they now have a name for their problems?
Well, people have, they have a name. A woman once told me when she discovered her disease, she breathed a giant sigh of relief. And she
Yeah.
said, "Oh, I finally figured out what my condition was. I just thought, I was screwing up randomly. You know what I mean? But now I understood that I had a condition." Um, the main ingredient, I know you and I know very smart people who are famous addiction theorists, one of whom's recently published a book. And when you and I look at it, we sort of say they really say a lot of true and accurate things. But one thing they're not good about is explaining themselves and their own lives for better or worse. That's a
Mm-hmm.
skill that seems to be a technique that people lack, and people seem to find it painful. They seem to feel like, saying something about themselves that's less than positive or accepting some negative feedback is intolerable. And the disease trauma industrial complex avoids that, or puts it in such a neat package that they don't have to confront or deal with it. In that little imaginary exercise I did with Gabor, I mean, Gabor's story, my pregnant mother was escaping the Nazis, I was traumatized and I bought CDs. Okay. But to say, I have some kind of a need to control situations, completely intolerant of disagreement, that's painful
Mm.
to come to grips with. And what you and I believe in the Life Process program is, how do you deal with that? You tell people, I actually have a specific, you have a natural gift at doing this. Sometimes I have a little spinner that I throw out there. I say, I don't believe there's anything you can tell me about your background that is worse than or nearly as bad as hundreds and thousands of things I've heard. And the way I express that is, I never react with shock, and I mean, I never go, whoa. I mean, I'm going to be the last person in the room to panic. That's just
Mm.
my rule of thumb. So people have told me, well, I had sex with my sister, and there's nothing we're going to do about that now. You know what I mean? And they'll tell me about all kinds of other kinds of traumas, and I'll not sympathetically and empathically, I'll say I understand that, and then I'll ask them how they've dealt with it. And sometimes people are guilty, honestly, about not being traumatized by that. I knew one woman who said, whenever I went to therapy, I would tell the therapist, I'm going to tell you something, but I just don't want you to make a big deal of it.
Mm.
I had sex with my sibling, but, that was 20 years ago, and that's not why I'm here now. Talking about that's just not going to make or break my case. And so I know people who have to de-traumatize the therapist. Well, I mean, that's what Gabor is training therapists to. When they hear stories like that, they're supposed to pounce on them. You and I in the Life Process program are equally likely, once we hear stories like that, to remark on people's resilience, to say genuinely, golly, you've had experiences that I haven't had, that many people haven't had, and look how strong you are. Look how much you've accomplished since then. I don't want you to sweep it under the rug, but let's just give you a little bit of appreciation for having, you didn't do that thing. You aren't the source of the trauma, and yet look at who you are. And in my personal life, the people I admire the most, the people I've been most intimate with, are people who've undergone substantial negative experiences. And I think it's made them better persons. It's made them more empathic. It's made them less high and mighty. It's made them appreciate and be able to acknowledge pain in themselves and others.
Mm.
I don't want to be quoted in some crazy way as saying Stanton Peele thinks trauma is good, but I think a certain amount of trauma in human beings' lives is inevitable, and if not necessary, a part and parcel of what makes for a complete human being. And what we're all striving for is to have a complete human being, somebody who has more positives than negatives, but can deal with and recognize negatives.
I'm reading Carl Hart's book right now.
I'll
be speaking with him. And one thing he said in the book, it was about racism, but I would generalize this to what we're talking about. He was saying, society sucks sometimes. And that, for you talking to Black Americans, and that is landed on you many times, but don't isolate yourself. I mean, you can't have a competition about who has it worse, or, nobody in the society that you're complaining about. You can't bring your problems and say, but don't you understand I have all these problems? It is true, and you have to be angry about it, and you have to fight against it. But in some ways, you have to make the system work for you. And I agree with that.
So Carl's a guy who, if he wanted to, he could become like one of that guy who wrote, Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah, right. The inner city version.
What the hell's the matter with all those other rednecks? I grew up in the worst redneck society. And look, I went to Harvard, wherever he went, Harvard or Yale, and, he's a bestseller. I mean, Carl could pull that out of his backpack. Yeah, who had it worse than me? Why aren't you a professor of sociology, psychology and psychiatry? And to combine having done that and being strong enough to do that, while being able to say, well, this is, it's a negative in people's lives that they have to confront. And I understand that. And it's, of course, it's one explanation. And when he says drugs are not the problem, he means people living marginalized, disrespected, lives without opportunity is one of the main sources of it. You have to change that. So pulling that duality, saying, I'm just not going to get mired down in that in my own life. What good's it going to do me? At the same time that I can recognize that it's something that people have to come to grips with. And there are people, who haven't had my attitude or brilliance to overcome it with. And I understand that, and I want to help them.
It's funny thing about you is that if anyone really understands what you're saying, across the board, you're trying to focus people in on the most disparaged parts of our society, the people in our society, to say, we need to do something realistic to help people get away from the bottoms of society into something like a flourishing life. But we're not going to do it with these nice stories that we paint, songs that we sing about them, stories that we paint about them that have nothing to do with what real, how real people live and get along and get better. So it's ironic that you would get pinned as somebody who's unsympathetic or, doesn't have any empathy because you don't like trauma theory, because in some ways you're saying, get out of the way so that, the real work for people who you're talking about can actually be done.
And my lifetime addiction is the stories of people who've overcome trauma. They make me cry. My favorite books, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn or The Glass Castle, are about people whose lives are like, a case study in trauma. And then they became somebody skilled and famous. It's just overwhelming to me that people can do that. It's a model for me myself. I haven't had that degree of trauma. But it's sort of like without beating people over the head, I want to say, you think you had it bad. People have it very, very, very bad. And most of them, this is positive psychology, Martin Seligman, remarkably high percentage of people from even the worst conditions are able to overcome them. And they do it in general by reinterpreting them in a positive way, at least as a positive impetus for going forward. The people who've been closest to me in my life, I won't name them, are people who've had experiences like that. And, I don't know, that's why I was drawn to them, but now I realize that's why I admire them so much. They're role models and they're reassuring for me. And we can end by saying, we're in a period, an awful lot of people now, we're having continuing record numbers of drug deaths. Every time you read an article, every other week, it's an article about, oh my God, mental health indicators are just, dropping out of the bottom. And it's based on, the pandemic on the one hand and the collapsing American system of democracy, there's plenty to be depressed about right now if you want to be. And it's ironic, in some crazy way, people who've had traumas are almost the people who are best inured and best prepared to cope with the situations we're in. There's a movie called Melancholia, which is about this woman who's, totally depressed. And then the moon or a planet's going to crash into the earth. And she's the only one who keeps her cool. Everybody who's well-adjusted freaks out, including, I think it's her brother-in-law, commits suicide. And she's the only one who's able to say, well, it's bad. I've had some bad moments in her life, but, let's see, how we can make the best of this situation. So, again, I don't want to be Pollyanna and say we're going to be led by the traumatized, but I often imagine people who've had some traumatic background saying, oh, pandemic.
Yeah.
Oh, Trump's ruining America. Oh.
The guy that I worked with, I talked with a lot in the harm reduction community, and he was at the last DPA conference where I was. And he said this thing to me that I remember. Basically, I said something about midlife crisis, joking. He was turning 50. And he said, me and the people I'm around don't have midlife crises. And it was what you're saying, you get it, right? Like,
my life's improved by now.
Right, exactly.
I had a childhood and early life crisis.
People who have draped their lives in the fantasy that, things are perfect, things can sustain perfectly, and you don't have to have any, road bumps in your life are the ones that give midlife crises. Yeah, him and the people he works with are improved.
So we're tipping our hat to Gabor Mate for identifying a large amount of trauma in society. And we're saying, let's mine that trauma and turn it into, fuel for living.